Would you judge someone without knowing their story? She did, and she paid the emotional price. The next morning, the monotonous hum of the airplane filled the cabin as passengers settled into their seats. It was a late flight from Dallas to Phoenix, a short trip that most passengers hoped to experience without incident. Among them was a tall man in military uniform. His neatly pressed camouflage trousers were unmistakably recognizable, and his movements were restrained and purposeful. There was respect in every step, yet he seemed to prefer to remain inconspicuous, part of the background. He only nodded to the flight attendants and quietly took a seat closer to the middle of the plane. A few rows ahead sat a woman in her 50s, dressed in an elegant jacket, exuding an aura of power. She adjusted her purse on her lap, looking around as if assessing who dared to disturb her peace. Her gaze landed on the soldier as he placed his bag in the overhead compartment. Something in her expression changed, almost imperceptibly, before she again buried herself in her phone. Flight attendants walked through the aisle, checking the order. As the soldier sat down, the woman slightly turned in her seat and muttered, loud enough for everyone around to hear, "You'd think they'd put people like that somewhere else. A uniform doesn't mean anything these days." The atmosphere in the cabin became electric. Passengers exchanged nervous glances, detecting her dislike, but her words hung in the air like an awkward silence. No one dared to contradict her cruelty. It seemed unthinkable to attack someone who had done nothing wrong, and yet not a single word was uttered. The plane took off, and the tension remained, like an invisible storm cloud, but the quiet discomfort in the cabin was just the beginning of what would turn this flight into an unforgettable experience. As soon as the plane leveled out and the fasten seatbelt sign went off, the woman's animosity seemed to intensify. She turned around several times in her seat, throwing glances toward the soldier. Her condemnation was as clear as the midday sun. She whispered to the passenger next to her, an elderly man in a Hawaiian shirt, who seemed torn between politeness and discomfort. "It's strange, isn't it, seeing a soldier on a flight like this? Don't they usually have their own planes or something?" The man shrugged, clearly not wanting to engage in conversation. But she did not stop. "I mean, these days anyone can put on a uniform. That doesn't make him a hero." Her words reached further than she probably intended, or maybe she knew what she was doing. A woman sitting across the aisle looked up from her book and frowned, clearly feeling uncomfortable. The soldier was silent, his attention completely absorbed by a notepad on his lap. He was writing something, perhaps a letter, perhaps notes. But whatever it was, it completely occupied him. He didn't blink, didn't look in her direction even once. His calmness seemed to irritate her even more. She pressed the call button for a flight attendant. Soon a young woman named Elena approached. "Yes, madam, how can I help you?" she asked. "I want to change my seat," the woman said, pointing to the soldier. "I'd simply prefer to sit somewhere quieter." Elena hesitated for a moment, hiding her surprise behind a mask of professionalism. "I'm sorry, madam, but all seats are taken. There are no other seats." The woman sighed, rejecting the problem with her entire demeanor, and waved her hand. "All right, I'll endure it." The passengers around her were clearly feeling uncomfortable. A middle-aged man hunched over his newspaper, but no one said a word. The unwritten rules of propriety bound everyone, despite the rising tension. The soldier remained calm. He continued to write, occasionally glancing up at the window. Whatever he was writing, it was more important than the petty remarks thrown in his direction. But his silence only seemed to embolden the woman. When the beverage service began, she made another passive-aggressive comment, loud enough for everyone to hear. "I can't imagine my father sitting next to someone like that in his day." Elena paused for a moment before quickly regaining her composure. "What would you like to drink, madam? Coffee or tea?" "Black coffee, no cream," the woman replied curtly, clearly annoyed that her comment hadn't elicited any reaction. The soldier ordered water and smiled warmly at Elena. "Thank you," he said in a quiet, confident voice. Elena smiled back, clearly relieved by the pleasant interaction after the tense exchange. As time passed, the woman continued her barely veiled insults, each one becoming more scathing. She complained about the service, the seats, the air conditioning. Each of her remarks was a barely disguised jab at the soldier. But while the passengers became more and more uneasy, no one could have predicted how quickly the mood would change and how deeply it would affect them all. And all this time, the soldier remained unwavering. He sat quietly, his broad shoulders relaxed, his gaze focused on the notepad in his hands. The corners of his lips would occasionally lift slightly, not quite a smile, but something thoughtful, perhaps even melancholic. It was clear that he had long since learned to weather such storms, not letting them break him. The soldier was young, but his uniform was worn. The thread was frayed in places. There was a faint trace of sweat here and there, but overall, it was impeccable, as if it meant more to him than just duty. For him, it wasn't just a piece of fabric. It was evidence of something greater. At one point, a little boy sitting in the row in front of him turned and stared at the soldier. The boy was no more than 5 years old, his chubby hands gripping the edge of the seat. "Are you a real soldier?" he asked with undisguised admiration in his voice. The soldier softened his gaze. "Yes, I'm a real one," he replied with a gentle smile. The boy's mother, sitting next to him, quickly apologized. "I'm so sorry, he's just curious." "It's okay," said the soldier, his tone warm and soothing. "It's good to ask questions." The boy smiled broadly, clearly amazed. "Do you fight bad guys?" The soldier hesitated for a moment with his answer. His smile faded for a fleeting second. "Sometimes, I help protect people," he said carefully, his voice sounding with a quiet modesty that spoke more than words. The conversation was short, but did not go unnoticed. Several passengers who had previously given him curious glances now looked at him differently, but the woman in the elegant jacket remained adamant. She rolled her eyes and muttered something under her breath about how he was playing the hero. The soldier did not react, returning to his notepad, continuing to write. A flight attendant whispered to her colleague, "He has more patience than anyone I've ever seen." And she was right. It wasn't that he didn't hear the woman's remarks. He simply refused to engage in conversation, perhaps because he had heard it all before. Maybe because he knew that there were battles worth fighting, and this wasn't one. Or maybe because he carried something much heavier than her words could ever be. As the plane approached its destination, the soldier neatly folded his notepad and placed it in his bag. He pulled out a small velvet box from his pocket and held it carefully in his hand, as if it were made of glass. For a moment, the expression on his face changed. The calm exterior faltered, giving way to something deeper, perhaps grief, perhaps reverence. The box was unremarkable, but it seemed to hold great significance. People around noticed it, but didn't dare ask. It was clear, without words, that everything inside it was important and not their business. The soldier closed his eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath. When he opened them again, his calmness had returned, as if he had drawn strength from the memories that were stored in the box. But the significance of this moment was not fully realized by anyone, not even the woman, until the next day, when the news headlines revealed what the soldier was carrying with him and why it was so important. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the windows of a suburban home in Scottsdale, Arizona. The woman from the flight sat at her dining table with a cup of hot coffee in her hands. She distractedly scrolled through her phone, browsing emails and social media. The flight from Dallas had been a completely ordinary affair for her, just another trip. She had already forgotten everything, unaware of the discomfort she had caused. Her morning routine was predictable, a quick look at the news before her mid-morning meeting. But today, a news article caught her attention because what was in the headline wasn't ordinary. The headline was eye-catching. Local soldier returns home from final mission, carrying the remains of fallen comrade. She froze, her finger hovering in the air above the screen. Something in the photo under the headline seemed familiar. She clicked on the link. When the page loaded, her breath caught in her throat. It was him, the soldier from that flight. His face was unforgettable. His calm eyes stared at her from the screen. The article told the story of his journey. Sergeant Elijah Brooks was returning home after a difficult tour of duty overseas. He was bringing the remains of his best friend and fellow soldier, Sergeant Adam Reyes, who had died in combat. The velvet box she had seen in his hands during the flight contained Reyes' dog tags, a precious memory for the grieving family. The further she read, the harder it was to comprehend the details. Elijah and Adam were childhood friends, inseparable since they went to school together in El Paso, Texas. They went into the military together, promising to always support each other, no matter what. This promise was tested at the end of their last mission, a rescue operation that went wrong. Adam shielded Elijah from an explosion, sacrificing his own life. Elijah was the one who retrieved Adam's body and brought it home to his family. The words began to blur as her eyes filled with tears. Her thoughts returned to the flight, to each of her spiteful remarks. She remembered how he had remained calm, how he had not said a word in his own defense. Now, she understood why he had ignored her. It wasn't indifference. He carried grief within him that was so deep that her petty remarks could not touch him. She put down her phone and stared into her coffee, losing all desire to drink. Guilt flooded her heart. She felt its weight in suffocation. She had judged him without knowing anything about him, reduced him to a stereotype in her mind. And yet, he had shown her only quiet dignity. The article concluded with a quote from Elijah: "Adam wasn't just my best friend, he was my brother. Bringing him home was the last thing I could do for him, and I will carry his memory with me for the rest of my life." The woman's chest tightened. She thought of her own brother, who had died years ago in a car accident. She remembered the pain, the emptiness, and how even the smallest act of kindness had meant the world in those dark days. How could she, of all people, be so cruel to someone who was suffering so much? Her thoughts swirled. What if someone had intervened on the flight? What if she had chosen to be silent? The weight of her actions pressed down on her, and for the first time in many years, she felt genuine shame. Looking out the window, the morning light seemed dull. She wanted to do something, anything, to make it right. The woman sat in silence, ignoring the noise of notifications on her phone. She replayed the article again and again. It now felt like a shard of glass in her chest. The calmness with which he had carried himself. The quiet dignity with which he had endured her sharpness. This article was on her phone, and her fingers trembled as she scrolled again through the photograph of Elijah, standing in full dress uniform beside a flag-draped coffin, burned into her memory. His expression was serious, resolute, but in his eyes there was a sadness that words could not convey. The woman could no longer hold back her tears. They flowed quickly and uncontrollably, her breath catching as guilt and shame overwhelmed her. She thought of her father's stories, a war veteran, about how soldiers form strong bonds, how they are willing to sacrifice everything for each other. And here she was, decades later, belittling a man who brought his brother in arms home, likely paying a huge personal price. Her thoughts returned to her brother, to the pain of loss, a wound that never healed. She remembered how once, in the early days of her grief, she lashed out at a stranger, an innocent shopkeeper who did not deserve her unjustified anger. It was a moment she had carried with her for years, a reminder of how easily pain can turn into cruelty. And here she was, doing it again, this time to a man who had already endured so much. She thought about the soldier's silence during the flight, how he refused to respond to her jibes. It wasn't because he was weak, she realized. It was because he was strong, stronger than she had ever been. He chose not to react to her words, focusing on what was truly important, and by doing so, he had shown her a quiet grace that she did not deserve. The thought of apologizing came to her mind, but how? She didn't even know his name until now. Finding him would be an intrusion into his personal life. And what could she say to make up for her wrongdoing? The weight of regret paralyzed her, but she knew that she couldn't leave things as they were. For the rest of the morning, she searched for information. By midday, she had learned more about Elijah's story and about the charitable foundation he had established in honor of his friend Adam, a foundation that supported the families of fallen soldiers. Her heart sank as she read about the hardships these families face, about the lives that had changed forever because of the sacrifices. The next day, she made a donation to the foundation. Her hands trembled as she wrote the message. It was short but sincere. Sergeant Elijah Brooks, I didn't know your story, but now I do. Thank you for showing me what true strength is. I apologize for my words, and I will carry this lesson with me for the rest of my life. Pressing the send button was a small step on a much longer path. She knew she couldn't erase the past, but she could choose to become better. She could choose to respect his sacrifices and the sacrifices of many others. The sun was setting. The guilt was still there. But now she was accompanied by a new resolve. She had seen the worst in herself and now wanted to become better. Not just for Elijah, but for everyone she would encounter in the future. Because, in the end, the weight of her actions wasn't just about the soldier or even herself. It was about what kind of world she wanted to help create. The woman's days after the flight were no longer ordinary. Every time she opened her phone or sat for her morning coffee, she remembered Elijah and what his story had taught her. His strength lay not in the uniform or medals he had earned, but in his unwavering resistance to ignorance. He had shown her that sometimes the strongest response is silence, and sometimes silence speaks louder than words. She carried this lesson in all her interactions with others. At work, she tried to truly listen to her colleagues, to not be quick to judge, and to show kindness. She contacted friends and family with whom she had lost touch, apologizing for the time she had not been the best version of herself. Gradually, she began to feel lighter. The weight of guilt was turning into a resolve to become better. The story of Elijah and Adam remained with her, not as a reminder of her shame, but as a reminder of the sacrifices others make and the importance of empathy. She shared this story with others, not in part about her own behavior, but about the two unbreakable bonds. Every time she concluded it with a simple message: we never know what battles others are facing, so let's choose kindness. As for Elijah, he never replied to her message, and she did not expect him to. Her apologies were not an attempt to gain forgiveness. It was an acknowledgement of her mistake and a lesson learned from it. She hoped that her donation would somehow help people like him. But she had changed. The woman who had once easily judged now tried to understand. She knew she couldn't rewrite the past, but she could shape the future, her own future, with compassion, humility, and respect. Because, in the end, it doesn't matter what words we speak in haste. It matters what actions we take afterward. So, if this story touched you, remember, every interaction is a choice. Let's make it one we can be proud of. If this story resonated in your heart, please hit the subscribe button and share this message of empathy and kindness. Let's spread it everywhere. Thank you for watching.